about the condition of modern Orthodoxy, specifically in both America and Israel. Our guest tonight is Rabbi Dov Lipman, who has both an interesting biography and an interesting career arc, who grew up in America in Silver Spring, moved to Beit Shemesh, where he began as a teacher in various post-high school programs for American students, and has slowly moved into Israeli politics, where he's become more and more prominent. The conversation tonight, we're going to begin with having him present something of his experience of American students in the Israeli programs post-high school. I'm hoping that we will segue from that into a discussion of the extent to which the communities are actually parallel with the issues that we experience in America, the same as the issues in Israel. Along the way, I think it's worth noting that we live in very interesting times for Orthodoxy, where the boundaries among communities within Orthodoxy, I think, are shifting to a degree that they haven't in many years. What defines non-Orthodox? What defines Haredi? If those terms are even useful. In Israel, the Sephardi-Ashkenazi divide is much more significant than it has been so far in America. That may yet reemerge. We had a wonderful conversation at a parent meeting for Gan Academy a couple of weeks ago, in which we thought it was about Orthodoxy and non-Orthodoxy, but it turned out for at least one parent, the question was, could you preserve Sephardi ethnic identity in the American day school system, accepted specifically Sephardi Academy. So I'm hoping we'll have a wide-ranging conversation beginning from the experience of American post-high school students. Rabbi Lipman is going to begin by presenting for somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. Rabbi Sandra and I may have questions, but we're really happy if it turns into a broad conversation with all of you. So feel free, when Rabbi Lipman is done, to begin asking lots and lots of questions. And if I just sit and listen, I'll learn a lot more that way.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi Sandra. Thank you, Rabbi Klapper. If at any point during tonight you see me yawn, it's not because I'm disinterested in any way. I did land this afternoon from Israel via Amsterdam, and I'm not exactly sure what time it is, but I'm sure that we'll get involved in a lively discussion, and I'll be fine. I'm going to begin actually with a story that goes back to when I was in elementary school. I went to the, at that point it was called the Hebrew Academy of Greater Washington. And it's a story which I think about often, because I really think it captures the challenge that we have in education today, and certainly in the Orthodox education scene. So every year is Yom HaTzmaut, and we come and we wear white shirts and blue pants, and it was going to be this big celebratory day. And as kids, we really, I can speak for myself, did not identify at all with what this whole day was about. It was fun. But in terms of what we were celebrating and what exactly Young Israel means, certainly for a kid growing up in America, it didn't mean very much to me. And every year they would show us this video about the chalutzim. And they'd show people with funny hats going out to this orchard. And the movie actually always began, it was a film strip, and it always began with this orange. It was orange, and then the camera zoomed out, and you saw this beautiful orchard. And we were sitting there, we'd watch it completely bored, and really had no way of connecting to this day or this holiday. One year, we go in there, and we sit down in the gymnasium, and we're ready for the film strip, and we're ready for the orange. And all of a sudden, the movie comes on, and it says, "The Washington Bullets in Israel." We were like, oh my goodness. Okay? And sure enough, our hometown professional basketball team that had just won the NBA championship went to Israel. And they showed all of our heroes. I saw Bobby Dandridge at the Kotel, and I saw Mitch Kupchak at Masada, and it was amazing. And they showed them playing against Maccabi Tel Aviv, and they showed highlights of the game. And we were like, we love Yom HaTzmaut. This is amazing. And we really, really were engaged that day because we somehow were captured by it. Next year, we came back, we were all excited to see more bullets, and there was that orange again. And I think about that story because it really, to a large degree, captures what I think are greatest challenges in terms of education today in the Orthodox world. And that is, I give, when I was teaching in yeshivot, I'd start my first day and I gave a 50-question test to my guys. 50-question test. And I would rotate questions, Torah questions, and sort of more pop culture questions. So there'd be a question which says, for example, can you list 3 Rishonim? Please list 3 Rishonim. And the next question would be, please list 3 NBA All-Stars. And I basically rotate between some basic questions of Judaism, basic questions in Torah, and then things that have to do with sports or general culture and the like. And I found, and my students actually, as they would go through the test, they would, after about 10 questions, say, wait a minute here, we see what's happening over here, right? Because they noticed that their mastery over more societal things and cultural things was there, and they had almost no mastery at all over very basic Jewish concepts. I want to divide what I want to talk about into basically 3 categories. One is essentially what do we do here in terms of the day schools themselves, in terms of preparing our children for the next stage, what happens in Israel while they're in Israel, and then what happens when they come back, because they really are 3 distinct areas. I am going to point out what I view as the problems in all 3 of those stages, but then also talk about solutions. One of the things that I've become a big fan of now that I've lived in Israel and gotten involved is, it's very easy to talk about problems, but we can also actually do something towards creating solutions. The number one issue, which I have found in terms of teaching kids in the post-high school system, but it also started when I taught in high schools in America. It applies mostly, this one issue, mostly to boys, and you'll see why in a moment, because the institutions where the girls do learn Gemara, the girls are usually embracing the Gemara when they're learning it, but it relates to the focus on Gemara. Somehow, we have fallen into this trap where the focal point of the experience in schools is Gemara. And the reason why I say it's the trap is because if you would do an analysis, if you take a step back and do an analysis of how much do these kids gain out of the time that they're spending in Gemara, gain academically, gain educationally, gain Jewishly, I think you would find that there's very little gain for the average students that are out there. And not only that, I actually think it has a negative effect. I think they actually begin to dislike Torah, the beauty of Torah, which could be there for them. They dislike it, and as a result, they also dislike Judaism. If you think about it for a moment, it makes sense that they dislike it. Okay? It's a language they're not familiar with on any level. Okay? You give them a page which has no punctuation, no vowels, discussions about things which they don't really understand where it's coming from in terms of the context. And also, we throw them into Gemara with absolutely zero background as to what's going on over here. I mean, I think about my own experience again. I started Gemara in 5th grade. 5th grade! I mean, the mind is just not prepared for a Gemara level thinking and the type of thinking in Gemara, but I had no introduction to Gemara. No context in terms of where is it coming from? Who are these rabbis who are discussing this? Where did it come from? Where did these discussions come from at all? There's no background at all. There's no historical context. And like I said, there's no skills whatsoever. Just to fast forward for a moment, the first yeshiva that I taught in Israel was called Yesodei HaTorah. Rosh Yeshiva is Rabbi Scott Kahn, who was from this area. He came up with a brilliant concept, which should not be brilliant, but it was brilliant. And that was, let's teach boys how to learn. Okay, it sounds so fundamental and basic, but it was like, let's teach them how to learn. Let's not just teach Gemara, but the whole concept was they learn how to learn, and they learn how to learn on their own. It was a brilliant idea, but to think about for a moment that most of these boys had already had 6 or 7 years of Gemara and never went through this process is very, very troubling. And like I said, what it does is the boys at that point, this is Judaism, this is what they're supposed to be doing, this is the hallmark of a Torah Jew is somebody who can really embrace Gemara, and they're totally turned off because of that experience. That's one dimension, is the area of what we're learning, and like I said, Gemara has been the focal point. Area number 2, though, where I see they struggle the most, is davening. Okay? Most kids, and this is boys and girls, okay? And by the way, girls, who in the girls' schools where I've taught at least, are definitely more spiritually in tune in terms of they want to make davening work. Okay, the boys don't even want to make davening work. The girls very much want it. Again, given these broad generalizations here. But they don't enjoy it. They don't enjoy it. They don't understand what the words mean. It's, again, the same words day in and day out. There's nothing enjoyable about it. And yet, if you go into a regular school, and when I was recruiting for the yeshivot and the girls' schools, I'd travel around to these high schools, and I'd see Rebbeim walking around, pointing to the sitter. Right? Come on, say the words. Say it. The kids don't appreciate it at any level. They don't understand what they're saying the same words day in and day out, and there doesn't seem to be any proactive effort to make it enjoyable or to make it understandable, but it's just, this is what we do as Jews. And now, basically what you have is a situation where, when they cross the ocean to go to yeshiva, so the two primary pursuits, Gemara and davening, are two things which they're already, for the most part, turned off from. The lack of hashkafa, Jewish philosophy, is something which I think is something which has to be addressed. When I started teaching in the States at a high school level, I thought to myself, what's a class that I could teach which I needed when I was in high school? And I thought to myself, a Jewish philosophy course. A Jewish philosophy course. Basic Jewish hashkafa. I went through a Jewish day school system myself, went through 2 years in Israel, came back to Young Israel of Baltimore, was in my 4th year of base matters learning, before I found an answer to one of the most basic questions which was troubling me throughout. And that was, why should I accept the Torah, the story of the Torah be given at Har Sinai? It was a question which I always had. I knew non-Jewish kids growing up, I played ball with them and the like, and no one in any kind of a systematic way ever addressed the basic question of, why should I be a Torah Jew? Of a very, very basic question. Nobody, by the way, ever actually talked about the topic of, why should I believe in God? Now again, by the way, just to understand, most kids when they come over to yeshiva and seminary, and I do ask this question, most do believe in God. Most have questions about God, but they do believe in God. But no one ever addresses these questions. No one ever creates a format where kids can ask these questions. Very basic questions. There are questions that trouble, why do bad things happen to good people? That is the number one question. It troubles any kid who's ever experienced any level of suffering. And any kind of, there's no format for them to talk about these topics, and these are things which they are certainly struggling with. The final issue does deal with language, and that is Hebrew. If you think about it for a moment, the average kid goes through 12 years of Jewish day school. If we did this right, they could be masters of Ivrit. 12 years of a foreign language, which shouldn't be a foreign language, they could be masters, yet they come. And again, I'm talking about the mainstream kids who come and they have no ability to open up any kind of a book, any kind of a sefer and read. I went to a Torah Masorah convention many years ago, and throughout the Shabbat, people were talking about all kinds of major issues, this, that, and the other. On Sunday morning, my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Yaakov Weimer, gave the keynote address. And he said, throughout the Shabbat, people have been talking about all kinds of issues about this methodology and this and the other. He said, I almost feel like we should get rid of all of it. Get rid of the Gemara and the Tanakh and everything, and just teach Hebrew. He said, because once a kid knows Ivrit, once a kid knows Hebrew, you've opened up the world of Torah scholarship, of learning to them, and that barrier which is there, it's a major barrier, would be removed. And there's no question when they come and we try to get them to read basic texts, you definitely see how they're struggling. The last area has to do with just a context in terms of Jewish history. Again, in that test that I give, I ask a lot of questions about Jewish history. Basic, fundamental components of Jewish history they know. What's the one thing they all know? Holocaust. The Holocaust. And again, I'm not against teaching about the Holocaust. But Jewish history is not just about the Holocaust, and we talk so much about it, and that they do know about. They'll tell you what Kristallnacht is, and they know what happened, but they don't know about other things, basic things that happen in Jewish history, a context in terms of Bayit Rishon, Bayit Sheni, Knesset Hagdola, Bavel, Yavan, all these types they don't know. So even Hanukkah, for example, which is a holiday which is celebrated throughout the Jewish world, throughout the diaspora as well, but if you would ask them to put it into a context of where were we during the Hanukkah story, what exactly was happening historically, what happened after the Hanukkah story, there's no idea at all in terms of all these facts in terms of history. So that's, You have to make sure you stay for the second half because these are all the problems, so we have to talk about solutions as well. The problems continue. And when the problems continue, I put that on our shoulders in terms of the educators in Israel. Okay, because parents send their kids away, thousands of miles away for an experience in Israel, and what actually happens there? First of all, what happens as Rebbeim is we tend to focus on two groups. We focus on the problem kids, okay, the kids who need rehab, okay, kids who are outwardly, externally very turned off, possibly into very bad behavior. So the Rebbeim spend a lot of their time on that. And we certainly spend our time on those who are succeeding and doing really well and flourishing, possibly even just externally, okay, becoming more frum. And as Rebbeim, you get very excited about that. Wow, there's a student who's, oh wow, he has his tzitzit out, wow, check, okay, he changed his kippah, check, he's davening with more shuckling, check. All of these external things which make it seem like progress is being made, and we tend, as happens in any educational setting, where you tend to focus more towards the top, that's where a lot of the attention goes. And you have an entire middle, the average kid who goes to Israel, experiencing Israel, who is not really being touched and really being addressed. Let's remember the curriculum in most of the yeshivot, okay, and here I veer from the girls' schools for a moment, is Gemara, 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 Gemara. And our goal is get these kids to be learning Gemara, find a way to get these kids to be excited about Gemara, which again, without the context, without the background, and again, building off of all the negativity from before. We don't do enough in terms of giving the kids very positive experiences with Israelis. What do I mean by that? Okay, the average kid at the end of the year, okay, and here I have to separate boys or girls who are in programs with Israelis versus those who are not with Israelis, you have to separate between the two. They walk away, believe it or not, with very negative impressions about Israelis and Israeli society. And from my perspective, that is catastrophic. That is catastrophic in terms of the future of Judaism. I'm not here saying that every single one of our children have to be pushed and forced to make Aliyah move to Israel, but my goodness, shouldn't we be fostering a Judaism where people are certainly exploring it and thinking about it and wanting it in terms of where we're heading, and yet very little is done to proactively engage them in terms of all the positives in Israeli society. They see Israel, and they tour Israel, but in terms of living a day-to-day life in Israel, very little is done in terms of that. Like I said, they tend to walk away with a lot of negative, especially when you add to the language issue, that they can't speak the Hebrew, and then they get into all kinds of issues with Israelis in terms of that. The last struggle which we have that happens overseas, and I don't know if parents are even aware of it, and that is what I call the iPod versus Shir. Okay, I can be the most exciting, entertaining Rebbe imaginable. I cannot compete with a movie on the iPod. I can't compete with it. And that is literally what my competition was when I was teaching afternoon Shir. Okay, and by the way, this applied in boys' school and girls' schools. Okay, places which were trying to be strict about attendance and places which were more lenient about attendance. But I can't compete. And this is what we're dealing with. You have kids who come with thousands of digital files of all kinds, and they can be lying in their bed, and for a Bayer, this is a real struggle. You come into the dorm room, so they obviously put it away right away. What's going on? I'm not feeling well. Okay, so what do you do at that point? You have these Ferris Bueller type challenges, right? What do you do at that point? You don't want to force them out of bed. You don't want to tell them they're lying, and yet they're sitting and they're watching movies. It's a very, very difficult challenge. Which, by the way, this challenge applies. If you talk to our Rebbe about it, from the most beginner yeshiva through the Mir yeshiva. Okay, everywhere, everyone's trying to deal with this issue of how do you engage them in the Beit Midrash and in Shiurim versus all the other things that are out there that are pulling them away. So let's talk for a few moments about some ideas in terms of solutions. I personally believe that there needs to be a total overhaul in terms of the curriculum in Jewish day schools in America. I think that the current system does not address all of these issues. I think that there needs to be far more Tanakh. You know what? We had a student at Yesodei Torah who did not like learning at all. He did not like learning at all. And I think this was Scott's idea, actually. He asked him, what do you like? Right? We were trying to find a way to get him to learning. What do you like? And the kid said, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I love violence. Like, I love reading war stories and things about battles and violence. So we suggested to him to open Tanakh and start from the beginning and keep score of the bad guys versus the good guys as we go through Tanakh. And he started going through it, and all of a sudden he loved learning Torah. Paragraph after paragraph, there's wars and battles, and this many killed, or this many, and it sounds like a very backwards approach, but Tanakh can be very engaging. It is very engaging, and we need to get back to the basics. Now, one of the reasons why we don't teach Tanakh is because we don't have teachers who can teach Tanakh. So that has to be addressed also in terms of preparing teachers who can really teach Tanakh properly. Just to show you the extreme of where this goes, just last week, and now I'm veering into my other life outside of education, but more into politics, but I was on a Haredi radio station last week being attacked for the fact that I took part in a rally that was advocating sharing the national burdens in Israel. That's the hot topic right now. And I spoke at this rally, and the radio host asked me, he said to me, what sources could you possibly have quoted at this rally to support your position? So I said, well, I quoted Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, I quoted Moshe Rabbeinu, "Ha'achechem yalchu l'milchama v'atem teshvu po," when the Shvatim asked to stay on the other side of on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and he said, "Will your brothers go to war, and you're going to stay over here?" So I quoted Moshe Rabbeinu, and he says to me, get ready for this quote. He says to me, "What in the world does our Moshe Rabbeinu have to do with Judaism today?" That's what he said. That's a quote. Okay. So when I thought about it afterwards, okay, obviously that's a very crazy thing for someone to say and very exaggerated, but on a certain level, we've lost that. I had a Rebbe in Young Israel, Rabbi Moshe Eisman, who said, if we would walk around to every big midrash in the entire world, to every yeshiva, and take out every Sefer Habakkuk, no one would notice it. No one would notice it, right? And yet, here's the Nevi'im and the Tuvim. These are messages for all generations we're supposed to be reading and analyzing and trying to apply to ourselves, and we don't. So I think the most basic change could be a major shift for the mainstream, from Gemara to Tanakh. I do think we should be obviously offering Gemara, certainly for the higher level students, but you'll see in a moment when I talk about the end of the story, in terms of what happens when they come back from Israel, why a focus on Gemara for the mainstream, to me, is problematic, and why we have to change from that. Getting back to Ivrit. You think about what high school students, if they have an intensive foreign language, Spanish or French or the like in high school, they have a basis of it. Think about starting from kindergarten, teaching kids Ivrit. There's no question if it was Ivrit, it would be even more effective. But teaching Ivrit, they should be leaving and graduating as seniors, being completely fluent in Hebrew. There's no reason why they shouldn't be. I mean, there's no education reason. You think about any level of teaching languages, children from the youngest of ages. Okay, I think about my own children. We made Aliyah. My oldest child was 7, and we had a daughter who was 4, a daughter who was 3, and a daughter who was just a few months old. But put aside my son for a moment, who was 7. Okay, my daughters, 4 and 3, within 2 months of being thrown into an Israeli system, they were speaking Hebrew. Little children at the youngest ages are sponges, especially when it comes to languages, and they can do it. And if we made that our focus, by 12th grade, they will graduate, they'll be fluent in Hebrew, and the world of Torah learning is open to them, whatever they want. If they're like Mishnah, if they're like Tanakh, if they're like whatever, Ramban. Again, obviously there's a different language when it comes to certain Sfarim, but you've broken down the major barrier when it comes to that, and also Tefillah, when it comes to davening. It's an amazing thing. Like my children, for the most part, they're not going through a process of translating in their heads when they daven. Okay? They understand what they're saying, for the most part. Here and there you have words which aren't familiar to them, but otherwise there's no process of translating. What a gift to hand to our kids, just to give them the language so they can be masters of that. Jewish history. Jewish history can be taught in the most engaging of ways, and kids can walk away feeling so proud to be part of the Jewish people. Right now, I talked about Hashkafa before, and I'll talk about Hashkafa in a moment, but they don't have a context as to why they're being taught this whole set of laws. We do have to teach halakha. Obviously, kids do have to know why they do what they do. But right now, they don't even understand a reason. There's no context in terms of who they are as a people to embrace this. And once they do start to learn that, It changes everything for them. Okay? I've seen it happen. Kids who've gone through basic Jewish history and understanding what we've gone through as a people from the beginning until where we are now, it changes everything. Just understanding Israeli history, by the way. Okay, as part of my questions, I do ask, what happened in 1948, what happened in 67, what happened in 73? Okay, and most kids cannot answer all those questions. Okay, 48 for the most part they do know. After that, things get very blurry. And again, to understand the context of what has happened over the last 64 years in Jewish history, use the Holocaust, teach the Holocaust for sure, but teach it in the context of what happened afterwards and where we are as a people now, instead of in terms of where we were 64 years ago and where we were during the Holocaust as well. And then finally, the issue of hashkafa, of Jewish philosophy. I have kids who to this day, and I'm not doing this to pat myself on the back at all, who told me that the class that I taught, Jewish philosophy, it changed everything for them. What did I do in Jewish philosophy? The first day, I said to them, there's a blank sheet of paper on everybody's desk. I want you to write down every single question that you have about Judaism. And I said to kids, don't put your names on top of it. I don't need to know who it is. Every single question that you have. And kids would sit and they would write. Writing and writing and writing. And you saw them just being able to ask the question was empowering for them. I would go home after that first day, take the sheet, basically put together the questions in various categories, and I would teach the course to their questions. Teach to their questions. And they walked away, even if they didn't embrace all the answers, and the answers aren't always the answers they want, but at least they walked away understanding something. Understanding a context of, like I said, what is God? The concept of God from a Jewish perspective. No one ever talks about that. Hashem, Hashem, Hashem. Right? I always joke to them when I talk about this, as kids we're taught Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. As a kid, I read up, up, down, down. Right? And then we talk about it in Jewish philosophy class that's really not true. Right? Because it's not true. God is both everywhere and God is nowhere. But the talking about it, okay, the idea of a relationship with a God, of what it means to have this being, is very important for kids to at least understand they can talk about. Because they've all been thinking about it, but no one ever addresses it. Again, Torah Sinai, Torah Shemal Peh. Why do I have to listen to what these rabbis teach me? Okay, do you realize the average kid, the moment he finds out that waiting between meat and milk is not just the Rabbanan, but that if they actually get a glimpse of a Shulchan Aruch and they see that the Ramah mentions this 1 hour thing, it throws everything off for them. Right? Because everything off for them. Because until this point in time, I thought this was like some Isser D'Oraisa, right? But it's such a troubling one for me. Okay, it's one of the biggest challenges, believe it or not, meat and milk. And now all of a sudden, and they all, almost all across the board, the moment they start not keeping it anymore. Okay, they start not keeping it anymore because if the Ramah says I can do 1 hour, why should I bother keeping the 6 hours? Boys, the moment they hear that tzitzit is not a chiyuv, it's not an obligation, okay, but it's a chiyuv that if you have a 4-quarter garment on, then you would put tzitzit on it, okay, they start dropping it very, very quickly. Very quickly. And again, there's no context to it. There's no context to any hashkafa behind all these types of things. Understanding what does it mean when we talk about Mashiach? What do we understand? What happens after we die? All these issues, okay? Women's issues, okay? Tackling head on. Okay? There are women, there are girls who come to seminary and they've never really had anybody talk about the role of women in Judaism. Equal, not equal, second class, not second class. Let's talk about it. Let's see the sources. Okay? And until they have these classes in seminary, they haven't talked. We have to get back to teaching it and letting them understand exactly why are there differences in terms of certain practices. Mitzvah seishes, man grama, all these types of things, to talk about it in a very open type of way, open up the dialogue, open the discussion, is something which we have to do. When we shift to the programs in Israel, I've become a big believer, with the exception of the elite. When I say the elite, I mean boys or girls who are ready for a full day of all-day learning. And there are, thank God, we do produce students who are that way, but it's not the majority for sure. It's not the mainstream students who are coming over for a major shift in terms of what happens in Israel to a combination of learning together with volunteering, together with interning, together with leadership programming, giving them both. Giving them both. A full day of learning for the average kid who's coming over is an impossibility. It's an impossibility. They're just not capable of doing it. And let's remember, when they come back afterwards, and now we're shifting gears a little bit into post-Israel experience, most are not going to be learning full-time here either. What happens to many of them, after they've experienced a full day of learning, this boys and girls, and then they come back and they're thrown into a university setting, okay, is they plummet. The bottom falls out. And I'm telling you this as someone who has experienced the highs and the lows of being a Rebbe. People say to me all the time, it must be the most rewarding job to have. Okay, especially Rebbeim and educators in America, to be teaching in post-high school. That's it. That's the job everybody wants, to teach in post-high school programs in Israel. Okay, and I tell them, on the one hand, it is extremely rewarding. On the other hand, it is very, very depressing. Because you spend a year or 2 years with these boys or these girls, and they come back here, okay, and you see their struggles. And for me, the hardest point, okay, I'm a big Facebook user because I actually started with being in touch with students. When I see that green light on Shabbat in America, it's Motzei Shabbat in Israel, and I see that they're online, there's nothing more just depressing and saddening, and it happens far more than people imagine. It's because one of the reasons for that is, if you spend a whole year and you're learning, let's say you're into the learning, and then you have to shift from a full day of learning to not learning that much anymore, that transition is very, very difficult for them. And therefore, what I find would work the best, and it's starting to happen more and more, is programs which do combine much more chesed, much more volunteering, much more interning, being involved in Israeli workplaces, Israeli society, connected on a deeper level in terms of my Judaism, not just in the Beit Midrash, but also outside the Beit Midrash. By the way, going back to high school as well, I forgot this point, but chesed is a huge component as well at the high school level. There are a lot of kids who do not connect to their Judaism through learning, but all of a sudden they find themselves spiritually through doing acts of chesed, and that's something which has to happen as well. But if we make that shift in Israel, then all of a sudden a lot of those challenges that I talked about, in terms of the Gemara versus the iPod, or whatever it is, it changes because they don't feel, when you create a scenario where you have to learn all day in order to be a good Jew, that's a very high standard. But if you say, learn for a strong 3 hours in the morning, then spend a strong afternoon doing something else, then coming back at night for a few more hours of strong learning, most kids can do that. Most kids are capable of doing that. And now all of a sudden, they're excited about their Judaism, they're excited about their learning, especially if it's on the basis of the curriculum change. Back when they were in high school, it's a total radical shift. And that gets into part 3, which is, along with that, strong, proactive, preparing them for the next step when they come back here, which doesn't happen enough. And that is to have real seminars and really talk to them about the challenges they'll be confronting them on college campuses. Hey, I'm one of the Rebbeim, I'm not against my students going to college. A lot of Rebbeim try to teach their kids not to go. Okay, they talk them out of going to various campuses. I don't believe in that. I believe they should pursue their dreams and they can do it, but prepare them for it. Prepare them for what those challenges are going to be. Hey, I have students, there was a group of 5 boys who I taught, who were doing very, very well when they finished Israel. They went back, they went to the University of Maryland, and the first week was they were presented with the challenge of the football game on Shabbos. Okay, because what happens? Everyone goes on Friday night to the parties before the football game. That's what they said, everyone, right? And everyone goes to the game on Shabbos. You pay beforehand, you get a bracelet, and you can go to the football game without being Machal Shabbos. So they told me it was such a big challenge, right? Not to go, not to be part of it. By week 3, all 5 of them were at the football game. Okay, by week 3. And these are boys, I'm telling you, they left Israel so strong and so committed, but the pressures for them were so overwhelming, and there they were on Shabbos afternoon watching the football game. Now again, there are kids at the University of Maryland who are learning tremendous amounts of Torah, balancing everything. And that shows that it can be done. But we have to prepare them for it in a very proactive way, talking about what the challenges are going to be, talking about how to deal with those challenges, and that's something which I feel, for the most part, is not done, and the kids are sort of on their own. Directing them to programs where there are rabbis, okay, whether it's through Chabad or whether it's the OU, whatever it is or the Hillel rabbi, is obviously very important. But we have to find ways to prepare them, sit and talk about what the challenges are going to be, possibly even bring students who have gone through it to talk about how do they make it, how do they get themselves to go to minyan, the importance of minyan 3 times a day, boys and girls, learning everything. To prepare them for those challenges is something which we have to do. I'm just going to end with just one story which I think really captures what we're talking about. There was a student of mine who I actually taught in high school, and then I taught again in Israel. For the most part, just a mainstream, regular Orthodox kid. Went through the system, struggled with Gemara like everybody else, but didn't rebel completely, struggled with Gemara, went to Israel, struggled there as well, but got into it in Israel. He got very into it in Israel, stayed for a second year in Israel, went back to university. He calls me up and he says to me, Rebbe, is it true that you don't get punished for a Avera that you do before the age of 20? That's a strange question. It's a strange question. I said, listen, I talked about, karet and the like, and it's talked about the age of 20. I said, what's going on? So he said, I can honestly tell you, he said that he's turning 20 in a week from now, he said, and I need to find a way to do tshuva. He says, because I have done everything. I said, everything? He said, I have done everything. He says, I came back, I was very strong, I was very committed, and it was just a matter of time. I had no real support system, I didn't have a real plan in place, and that for me, was a very eye-opening experience, because he was honest with me. It was almost like this confessional type of experience, but he was being very honest with me about what he had gone through. And this is a mainstream kid, mainstream family, a kid who was never very rebellious in terms of his nature, but when you look about the path, right, where he wasn't in a situation where he was really prepared to be able to, 2 years in Israel is not enough that I can open any sefer anywhere and learn with anyone and be able to make forward. So if he didn't have the system of the yeshiva around him, he was not able to make it. And that's what I think we have to get. We have to think back to ourselves from the youngest of ages. How do we get to a point where a kid at the end of the story is on a university campus somewhere and is excited to learn, wants to learn, is capable to learn, is engaged in learning, is engaged in Judaism, engaged in davening, all of these things. It starts from the earliest of ages to try to be able to create a scenario where we're thinking in terms of that. The kid who ends up afterwards in a mainstream yeshiva or seminary type of situation back in America, that's the exception. Okay, the mainstream aren't in that situation. We have to find ways to be able to address those problems from the earliest of ages, carry it through in Israel, and then prepare them for their time afterwards. I do believe it's possible. I believe it's possible. I think we need some leaders from the top talking about it. I have heard some people talking about shifting. I had a conversation certainly with Rav Schechter. We talked about the need for curriculum change at a high school level. And I think it can happen, but I think it has to happen. I think we have to make it happen. And it's the kind of thing where no one wants to be the first. It's one of those problems where in the yeshivot in Israel, no one wants to be the yeshiva that stops teaching Gemara all day, or for most of the day, because then we're the not so from yeshiva anymore. And that no one wants to be that place. But I think that we have to be bold, we have to be determined and say there's a problem, and when there's a problem, that problem has to be addressed. And en masse, make that change, and I think you will find kids who are much more engaged in their learning, and most importantly, so much more proud and understanding of what it means to be a Torah Jew in the generation that we live. Thank you for your time, and I'll certainly... Yes?
So first of all, I'd say, much better for what you're saying. And if there was a yeshiva that really was centered around Mikra and Tanakh and Hebrew, I'd immediately send my kid, when is it opening up?
Well, that's why when I talk about leaders, I really believe the job of Jewish leadership has to be to solve problems. I was at dinner, I was talking to the students here about my relationship, or I mentioned my relationship with Rabbi Salam, who's a member of Knesset, who was trying to tackle, and he always says that the job of a rabbi today, right, unfortunately, in many people's eyes, has been to create problems instead of to solve problems, right? We're problem solvers, and I do think that if people get together, this can be addressed. And it has to be slow, obviously. Like I said, you have to have teachers who can teach Tanakh properly. But I think it can happen. That's all I can say. Meaning, who's going to be the first? Which is going to be the first community to really make the shift? I don't know. But people have to really see the depth of the problem, the depth of the disservice that we're doing to the kids. I have a son who's learning in a yeshiva, which has a lot of Gemara in Israel. It's called Mitzpeh Richo. He just finished 9th grade, and he finished and knows Brachot, Megillah, Tanit, Rosh Hashanah, and Chagiga. They have a whole system there. And I was thinking about, like, why does it work? A lot of it is language. A lot of it is language. Even though it's Aramaic, but it's a whole different approach. And he himself, my son, said he cannot wait to see the Karen Gemara, right, which is going to have punctuation and vowels in it, because it'll just make it so much easier. Right? So that in and of itself is a major change for a kid to see a Gemara, which has the question mark and has the comma, and I'm not sitting and trying to figure this out. That's a major shift. So what do people used to say? But amelus b'Torah. Right? We have to be amel b'Torah. You have to be sitting and working hard on Torah, and if you put punctuation in the Gemara, then not being amel b'Torah. You know, my Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Weinberg, on the first pasuk of Bechukotai, right? Bechukotai telechu. So every yeshiva in the world, the drasha that Shabbos is about amelus b'Torah, because Rashi says on Bechukotai telechu shetiyu amelus b'Torah. You should be toiling in Torah. So every yeshiva, that's what they talk about that Shabbat. My Rosh Yeshiva asked, does it make sense to you that all the blessings and curses depend on amelut b'Torah? Right? Amelut b'Torah, that's what all the curses are dependent on? He said that we're reading the Chazal wrong. It's not shetiyu amelut b'Torah that we should be toiling in Torah. It's shetiyu amelut kama b'Torah. That every single thing that we do in our lives has to be with Torah. That's what b'chukotai telechu, right? Everything, as you walk, as you do things during your day, you're doing it with Torah. Is our goal that our students should be b'chukotai telechu, to amelem b'Torah, that they're all amel b'Torah? How many students, how many kids down the road are really amel b'Torah in their lives, throughout their day? But we want kids who are amelem kama b'Torah, that as they're functioning in the world, and they're part of the world, they're doing it with Torah values and with halacha and understanding who they are as Jews. That's the goal. So, doing a simple thing like punctuation and vowels of the Gemara, a simple thing like that takes a kid and enables him down the road, I believe, to be more amelem kama b'Torah, right, instead of the amelem b'Torah. I think that's where the shift has to take place. Yeah.
I think it's wonderful that you're speaking about these issues. Both my sons went to a Hebrew day school, and around 4th grade, all the students were given an option if they wanted to learn what tefillah meant, or Mishnah, and I think it was the 3rd option. Both my boys, they were around 6 years apart, independently of each other. They both picked wanting to learn what tefillah meant. And I got calls from the rabbi that night saying, "We're sorry, it's really just for girls." And I said to myself, if the boys were counting the million or expected to daven 3 times a day, and they're not being taught what tefillah meant. I myself didn't grow up in an Orthodox environment, and I've taken on going to chakras and occasional mitzvah. And I am learning the prayers now. But to keep up with the congregation is challenging. And if I do keep up, I have to learn what the prayers mean on my own time.
First of all, by the way, Rosh Schechter, when I talked to him, it was a very brief conversation, but he actually used the language you just said. He said, we need to apply the girls' curriculum to the boys. It's actually the language that he used. So just in terms of the pace, I had a grandfather who didn't grow up in an Orthodox environment and came to Orthodoxy much later. He used to tell me he likes davening by himself. He said, I can't daven a minyan, I can't keep up with their pace on any level, and I like davening by myself. So I definitely can hear that. One of the things, by the way, for davening, this is a little tip for certainly all the parents or grandparents, the moment kids hear that they can use their own words in davening, add their own words into davening, that is a radical shift for them. It's amazing to me that they go through a day school system and aren't taught that they can add into davening. There's tefillah and there's tachanunim, right? So tefillah is the set tefillot, and it's important to say it and teach them why it's important to say these words, who wrote these words are packed with meaning, and the place of korbanot, and even if you don't understand them, it's still have meaning. But then the tachanunim, and to say your own words, and there are kids who tell me that their davening changes. The moment they know that they can just pour their hearts out to God. That's an amazing thing. I tell my students, there was a period of time that I was really struggling with davening when I was in yeshiva in Young Israel. I went to Rav Weinberg about it, to my yeshiva, and I said, it's so hard, 3 times a day. It's hard to have kavanah. And he says to me, you're looking at it the wrong way. He says, if you go to sleep at night knowing that for 30 seconds during your day, you actually had a real bond and were communicating with the Almighty, what a day you just had. So don't focus on 3 tefillos a day, all the brachot. Let's get one bracha with kavanah where you really feel like you're connecting to a divine being, and that's an amazing thing for a Jew to experience.
Should secular subjects also be taught Be'ivrit?
Oh, wow. I think that, let me say it this way. There's no question, if we could get to that point, that would be incredible. I think that's asking for way too much of a shift at this point to find the teachers who do it. But there's no question, the more the kids are engaged in it, they will certainly be, they'll have both languages. But I do think we can do a lot on the secular side to teach it towards Judaism as well. What I mean by that is, when you're teaching, there's nothing for a student like seeing examples in the secular side of people who are also Torah Jews. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having non-Jewish teachers, that's fine. But whenever that can be done, when you can have a person who's a man or a woman who clearly knows a lot of Torah and are observant, who are masters in mathematics or science or history and the like, it shows kids that it models for them that the ability to have both. I think there's an incredibly powerful message in that. That's for sure.
Well, there are schools that do this a little bit. I was thinking as you were speaking, there's like Schechter. There are schools that have a lot more Hebrew that try to integrate it a little bit. I'm not so sure that the outcome, the finished kid, so to speak, is any different than a child going through an Orthodox day school. Although I applaud very much what you're saying. I'm just kind of curious about that.
Well, 2 things. First of all, I'm not suggesting that we shift at all in terms of our focus on the needs for practicing as observant Jews. Meaning, I'm not saying to move off of that. But we have to balance that together with other things which will make the kids embrace learning and embrace their Judaism. You know that there's a yeshiva in New York, yeshiva Flatbush, could be that you're familiar with it. The kids who I've taught, this is my own observation, and none of this is the scientific data, they have a strong Hebrew program there. And they're able to catch on to learning when they're in Israel far easier than the other students because they have that Hebrew component. And I think you can do it without taking away from the overall Jewish practice, but just focus on it. By the way, I was involved with the high school at some point. I talked to the state of Maryland about it, and our foreign language was Hebrew. And they accepted it, it was totally fine. Right? So now, my students, again, knowing Spanish is wonderful, but if you can give your kid Ivrit during those 4 years of intensive, as part of their secular studies, so to speak, that's another way of doing it without taking away at all from the Torah component.
How do you feel an educational track that includes YU or Stern fits into this, and do you think it makes a big difference?
Right. A lot of my students. Now, again, I'm not an expert on YU, so I didn't go to YU, and I want to be clear about that.
Me neither.
Okay. A lot of my students go back to YU, and after about 2-3 weeks, they're on the phone with me. I want to shift out of the yeshiva program to another program because I'm not capable of the Gemara all day. There are kids who flourish in the yeshiva program. I'm more concerned about the kids who aren't flourishing in the yeshiva program in YU. I'm concerned about the kids who made the decision, I can't be in the yeshiva program, I need to be in another setting within YU or their other college campuses. So I think it's a mistake to suggest that we're going to teach a generation of kids with the perspective of they're going to YU. It's not where all the kids end up. That's not where most of the kids end up. And I think we have to be concerned about that. I certainly think the higher level kids who then go to yeshivot in Israel where they are able to right away, be put in a beit midrash, given a Gemara and learn, we should have a track of Gemara for them as well. There's no question that should be there throughout. But I think we have to be worried about the mainstream kid who's not going to end up in the YU yeshiva program.
I guess, thank you. Now I'll try and push it over Shabbos. Israelis have the same problems, and they don't have a language barrier. So I'm not at all convinced that turning Americans into slightly weaker Israelis is the solution to the higher intellectual level in that regard. And many of the suggestions that you're making curricularly have been tried in Israel in an attempt to resolve what was seen as a spiritual crisis of Israeli youth. And so far as I know, the Yoel Finkelman has done studies, they haven't been effective at all. So I'll put the challenge as starkly as I can. There is often a temptation, there are two things. One is there's often a temptation to when you, right, one work, the major successes one has as an educator are other people's failures. So there's, right, and so often there is a temptation to say, because I did this and that worked where that failed, so it would work just as well for the ones where that succeeded. But it might not. It might be that, right, the other person is saying that their method working with your failures and producing their successes. The other is that almost always, I think one really effective means of exciting kids is to tell them that you're teaching them something other than what they think is standard. My wife and I always say, like the most important things have to be in tangents, because the kids are really excited about tangents because they think they're deflecting it. Right? So if you can only convince them that the really important material is not what you're supposed to be teaching, then ideally something that the school would be really angry with the teaching. I've done it on occasion, right? It's good, to talk about the things that the school would damn you, that you can't tell the principal about my teaching you and things like that. Sometimes truthfully. So I'm wondering, I guess, let's put it as that challenge. First, I guess the question I'm really interested in focusing on is, are the American students so different than Israeli that the solution you're proposing, which I'm suggesting, is largely trying to turn Americans into Israelis, is really going to work?
So, two things. First of all, again, I don't have scientific data to get into a debate about the issue. I do think the mainstream Israeli kid is more engaged Jewishly and learning-wise than the mainstream American kid. That's just what I see. Certainly in our neighborhood, there are kids that are struggling with certain issues, and a lot of that is because of hashkafa, more than anything else. But I do definitely see, in terms of minyan, in terms of certain things that are basics in Jewish life, even the kids in Israel, certainly in the neighborhoods where we live, who are sort of turned off, they go to minyan, they are doing certain things which a lot of mainstream kids here you don't see. That's number one. In terms of the language barrier, again, like I said, a lot of the kids in Israel, it could be that they're doing it because they have bagriyot, they have matriculation exams in Tanakh, and things like that, which they have to study. But they're learning it. They're learning it. I mean, they're sitting there, and the last few weeks of June, you see them engage in studying things which the mainstream kid here isn't studying. Obviously, living in Israel, Judaism in general is far more on the radar screen than it is for a kid here. But I definitely find a lot of parents, I've worked with a lot of kids in Israel who are turned off. Okay? As I talk with them about hashkafic issues and things like that, they're far more turned on than a turned off kid here also. I mean, that I've seen clearly. So there's definitely a change. There's definitely it's easier for them in terms of the language, there's no question about it. And from my perspective, that starts them at a certain place where our kids are not. And therefore the challenges along the way are much easier for them. That's what I've seen. Yes? That's fine.
What about the kid who has been turned off because his questions are rejected? How do you bring him back?
The question was, how do we bring kids back whose questions were rejected? A kid who tried to ask questions and had teachers who either rejected the questions or made them feel bad because they had the questions. I don't want to say it's irreparable damage, but it's very difficult to restore that trust. No question about it. The only thing I can say is if you provide a vehicle for them to be able to ask the questions in a comfortable setting where they feel they're not being judged, then hopefully that could be the most devastating thing that can happen to a student. There's no question about it. A lot of them don't even realize that the answers exist, that there are answers. They don't even realize that Sfarim deal with hashkafa, Jewish philosophy. They don't even know that it's out there. And once you open their eyes, maybe they have to read it on their own. You provide kids with. I very often, one of the things that we do every institution where I've taught, is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and Hashanah Aleph is like the scariest experience because you're taking kids and telling them they have to daven all day, right? Again, and they're not inspired by it. So one of the things that we do is we lay out all of the English books about Judaism. And we say, you're not in the mood to daven, just read. Spend the day in shul, don't leave the Beit Midrash, but just read. And there are a lot of kids with that experience. They all of a sudden they sat and they actually read certain books and saw that there were answers to certain questions that they had. That in and of itself was a shift for them. But how do you take a kid who's been rejected and turned off and bring him back? There's no solution that I know. A simple solution to that problem.
Okay, I'm going to just go back for a moment to Rabbi Klapper's point. I think the presentation of the problems being, we have a Gemara-focused, non-Hebrew-focused, not Tanakh-focused, vision, and therefore that's where the problems come from, right? First of all, I think Rabbi Klapper is correct that the fact that in Israel the problems still exist, and then models like this have tried and failed, it seems to indicate there are other issues going on. Besides for that, just to put my own, educational